Namo Ramana. A warm welcome to all of you for this Satsang with Mr. Michael James. With this, I would request Narayananji to start with the puja.
Achyudaya Namaha, Anandaya Namaha, Govindaya Namaha. Suklam Parvaram Vishnu Sajivannam Chaturpujam Prasannavadam Jhaye Sarva Vigno Vasante. I am Mr. Samusargo Vindo, Mando no Pranando, I am Mr. Samusadosto, Tadeva Dalam Sadevam Tadeva, Saravalam Santravalam Tadeva, Vidyavalam Daivalam Tadeva, Lakshmi Pate Deviyam Smarami. Om Go, Om Bhuva, Om Suva, Om Maha, Om Jana, Om Tava, Om Satyam, Om Satsodharvavanyam, Bhargo Devasya Dhimi, Dhiyo Yo Na Prachodaya. Om Avadrutrisa Amrudam Bhurvavaswara. Namo Pata Samasta Durga Shaitwara Sri Parameshwara Prityastam Karishyamanisya Karmana Durvenan Pasanya Sattam Ado Vindeswar Pujam Karishye Prithviya Bhairat Tulsuri Surab Janta Gormo Devada Prithviya Tirga Noma Devikam Vishnu Sura Varsat Harima Devi Goptram Pursanam Agamartam Tu Devanam Amnatam Tu Raksha Kandaram Parayamadhyam Divduvan Adamkanam Namo Bhata Samasta Durga Saitwara Sri Parameshwara Nityam Nirvadasityam Ado Vindeswar Pujam Karishye Gananatva Ganapatikam Avamahe Kavim Gavina Bhuvastratram Jesharajam Brahmanam Brahmanaspure Anustumum Kirsidaram Asmin Dajita Bimbe Mahaganapati Vyayami Mahaganapati Avamayami. Om Mahaganapati Namaha. Asaram Samarpayami. Om Mahaganapati Namaha. Arjam Samarpayami. Om Mahaganapati Namaha. Adyam Samarpayami. Om Mahaganapati Namaha. Asmuniyam Samarpayami. Om Mahaganapati Namaha. Om Sarikasnanam Samarpayami. Om Mahaganapati Namaha. Nanangaram Asmuniyam Samarpayami. Om Mahaganapati Namaha. Vastusatam Akshadam Samarpayami. Om Mahaganapati Namaha. Yajno Vigatam Akshadam Samarpayami. Om Mahaganapati Namaha. Gandhamdayami Samarpayami. Om Mahaganapati Namaha. Gandhovari Akshadam Samarpayami. Om Mahaganapati Namaha. Gandham Akshadam Samarpayami. Om Mahaganapati Namaha. Aritrakumam Samarpayami. Om Mahaganapati Namaha. Pushpai Pujayami. Om Sumulaya Namaha. Om Ekadangaya Namaha. Om Katilaya Namaha. Om Jagannaya Namaha. Om Lambodharaya Namaha. Om Vigadaya Namaha. Om Vignaradaya Namaha. Om Vinayakaya Namaha. Om Dhumaketave Namaha. Om Ganapakshaya Namaha. Om Balachandraya Namaha. Om Gajanaya Namaha. Om Vakrtundaya Namaha. Om Surpakarnaya Namaha. Om Herambaya Namaha. Om Sandamurjavaya Namaha. Om Siddhavinayakale Namaha. Om Sankaramoksha Vinayakale Namaha. Om Apurapane Vinayakale Namaha. Om Mahaganapatiye Namaha. Nanavida Paramana Patra Pushpani Samarpayami. Dupatam Samarpayami. श्रीपाठं समर्पयामि अक्षतां समर्पयामि। ओम भूर्भुवस्सुवः तत्सवितुर्वरेण्यं भर्गो देवस्य धीमहि धियो यो न प्रचोदयात्। देवसौतप्रसन्न सत्यं दोषेण प्रसारे अमृतत्वं स्वाहा ओम प्राणाय स्वाहा वाणे स्वाहा उदाने उदाने त्वं समाने स्वाहा ब्रह्मणे स्वाहा महागणपतये नमः महागणपतये नमः महागणपतये नमः। वरदंड नैवेद्यं समर्पयामि मध्ये मध्ये पानीयं समर्पयामि अमृतोपचार सूत्राभोगं समर्पयामि नीराजनं समर्पयामि नीराजनम् आसमनीयं समर्पयामि। हरि ओम हरि ओम हरि ओम। कर्पूरं समर्पयामि। गणानां हवामहे कविं कवीनामुपस्थितां ज्येष्ठराजं ब्रह्मणां ब्रह्मणस्पते आनन्दं पंडितानां महागणपतये नमः महागणपतये नमः महागणपतये नमः। कर्पूरं समर्पयामि नीराजनं समर्पयामि नीराजनं आसमनीयं समर्पयामि। हरि ओम हरि ओम हरि ओम। वक्रतुंड महाकाय सूर्यकोटि समप्रभ निर्विघ्नं कुरु मे देव सर्वकार्येषु सर्वदा गणपति प्रसादं सरस्वतीर्णम्। ओम 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 स्व ओम नमः ओम तन ओम तव ओम सत्यम ओम तत्सर्वभवनं भर्गो देवस्य धीमहि धियो यो न प्रचोदयात्। ओमावधूतस्य अमृतमस्तराम्। मोपाता समस्त दुर्द कैसा कि परमेश्वर की चेतन सुबह 2 महीने सुबह आज की ब्रह्मण नित्य बनाते वे वेदे विवस्वत मनमंत्रे अष्टाविंशति में कलियुगे प्रथमे पादे जम्बू द्वीपे भारतवर्षे भरतखंडे नेरो दक्षिणे पार्श्वे तडाप्ते अस्मिन् वर्तमाने व्यावापित प्रवासिनां तस्य संवत्सराणां मध्ये आत्मनाम सूत्रे भानुवासर युक्ताया सार्वरी वर्ष भानुवासर युक्ताया तदविक सशस्त्र युक्ताया षष्ठी तिथिया शुभ तिथौ मम जन्म पापस जन्म प्रति एतच्चनपर्यन्तं मुक्तिये सर्वेषां पावानं सत्य अनुनातं प्रेमसर्य सकल प्रेमसर्य भाग्यं सकल सत्यं आयुरारोग्य ऐश्वर्यम् अभिवृद्धिं समस्तं प्राप्तिं समस्त दुर्गं रमणवश्ये जामवश्ये दं कल्प पूजां सत्करिष्ये। विघ्नेश्वरं यथास्थानं प्रतिष्ठापयामि सोमनाथे क्षेमाय पुनरागमनाय कलस्य मुखे विष्णुकण्ठे रुद्रसमाधिस्थं मूले तत्र विष्णुतो ब्रह्मामन्त्रिय मन्त्रकासुरा कुसौ तुषाकराचर्ये सप्तत्विधासुरा ऋग्वेदो यजुर्वेदो सामवेदोपनर्मण गंगे सुमेधसे गोदावरी सरस्वती नर्मदे सिंधु कावेरी जलेस्मिन् सन्निधिं गुरु अंधक्षेत्रस्य कर्तापितमाचर्ता अजन्तु देवपूजार्थं दुर्दशकारका तंबूरा सर्वपन्न विष्णाकरे देवस्य पुष्पे देवस्य पात्रने मुझे देवो देवालय तो देव देवतान अन्यान निर्माल्य सोयाम भवने पूर्वे ओम सकल गुणात्म शक्तियुक्ता योग मीलाकरे नमः अगार शक्तिये नमः मूल प्रगतिये नमः आदिवराय नमः आदिगुरुमाय नमः आनंदाय नमः आदित्यादि नमस्कार देवदूत्यो नमः ततदिक्पालेभ्यो नमः गुरु ब्रह्म गुरु विष्णु गुरुदेवो महेश्वरा गुरु साक्षात् परब्रह्म तस्मै श्री गुरवे नमः। ओम अस्य श्री प्राणप्रतिष्ठामन्त्रस्य ब्रह्मा विष्णु महेश्वर ऋषिरिति सामकर्माणि संतांसि सकल जगत् सृष्टिगति सम्मार्गाणि प्राणशक्ति परादेवता आम बीजम हरिं शक्ति रोगिरगम प्राणप्रतिष्ठाप्ते विनियोग आम अंगुष्ठाभ्यां नमः हरिं गर्भविद्यां नमः रोम मध्यमाभ्यां नमः आम अनाभिलाभ्यां नमः हरिं गरिष्ठाभ्यां नमः रोम कर्णकुष्ठाभ्यां नमः आम हृदयाय नमः हरिं सरसे स्वाहा रोम सिगाय आम कौशलय हरिं नेत्रदाय कौशल रोम अस्तलाकट पूर्ववस्तरूपी दिग्बंध ध्यानम दग्धामोगिष्ट बोधोरत सर्वसनकराप्ते आसंगोदंड मिश्रुत्व मणिमोहन संबंधमाना विप्राण सुखवाल तेरे सिद्धा तीनमसो रोटिया देवी बाला दोना बहु प्राण शक्ति पराना ओम आमनि प्रोम रोमरिमा अम्यम रत्नम वंशम शम्मा अंश स्वाम स्वाम अंश अस्यामुतो जीवनस्तु अस्यामुतो सर्वेंद्रियाणि वाङ्मनस्पर्श सूत्र दिव्या प्राणवाक् पाणिवाद आयुपुष्टानि या कस्ति स्वस्ति सुतंत्रं दृष्टन्तु स्वाहा। ओम अत्यसि प्राणप्रतिष्ठामन्त्रस्य ब्रह्मा विष्णु महेश्वर ऋषिरिति सामकर्माणि संतांसि सकल जगत् सृष्टिगति सम्मार्गाणि प्राणशक्ति परादेवता आम बीजम हरिं शक्ति रोम कीलकम प्राणप्रतिष्ठाप्ते विनियोग आम अंगुष्ठाभ्यां नमः हरिं गर्भविद्यां नमः रोम मध्यमाभ्यां नमः आम अनाभिलाभ्यां नमः हरिं दक्षिणाभ्यां नमः रोम कर्णकुष्ठाभ्यां नमः आम हृदयाय नमः हरिं सरसे स्वाहा रोम सिगाय नमः आम कौशलय हरिं नेत्रदाय कौशल रोम अस्त्ररापट पूर्ववस्तु दिग्बंध असुनीदे पुनरस्मात् सत्सपुरं प्राणमी नोतो योगम दोपस्य में सूर्य मुचर्न मनमुदरे प्रयासति आवाहितो भव सदाब्दो भव नीतो भव सन्निधो भव सुगुंडितो भव सुब्रतो भव सुब्रसन्नो भव वर्धो भव प्रसिद्ध स्वामी सर्वजगन्नाथ यावत् पूजावकरणं तावत् धुरं प्रतिभागेन इन्देस्मिन् सन्निधं कुरु। ओम नमो भगवते श्रीकुबेराय नमो भगवते श्रीकुबेराय नमः नमो भगवते श्री अरुणाचल रमणाय नमः ओम नमो भगवते श्री अरुणाचल रमणाय नमः ओम नमो भगवते श्री अरुणाचल श्री रमणाय नमः ओम नमः शिवाय ओम नमः शिवाय ओम नमः शिवाय ओम नमः शिवाय। I will recite the Ashtotra. अबार सच्चि सुगवारी राशोर यशोर निमात्रम भुवनं समस्तम वायुदम संब्रह्मं कबीरम चिंताविहीनम हृदि चिंतयामि। ओम आते नमः शेन जाताय नमः ओम श्री रमणाय नमः ओम गुरवे नमः ओम अगण्य संविदागराय नमः ओम मौजसे नमः ओम कारणोद्भवाय नमः ओम जगत्पितावताराय नमः ओम श्री भूमिनाथस्थलोचिताय नमः ओम पराशर कुलोतंसाय नमः ओम सुंदरास्तवफलाय नमः ओम कमनीय सुचारित्राय नमः ओम सयाय भाषयाय ते नमः ओम सोणासुर मोहलीन मानसाय नमः ओम स्वर्णाष्टकाय नमः ओम श्रीमद्वादशांत महात्मने रक्त विद्योदयाय नमः ओम महाशक्ति निवादेन प्रवृत्ताय नमः ओम परमात्मविदे नमः ओम दिग्विदाय नमः ओम पितृविदान्वेषिते नमः ओम हिंदू मौलिना पितृपदे नमः ओम विदुरादेश सोणशैलं प्राप्ताय नमः ओम तमोमयाय नमः ओम उदासीनाय नमः ओम महायोगिने नमः ओम महोत्साहाय नमः ओम कुशाग्रदिये नमः ओम शांत संकल्प संप्रभाय नमः ओम सुसुंदृसे नमः ओम सवित्रे नमः ओम स्थिराय नमः ओम अवश्यभीत सर्वंगाय नमः ओम उल्लामूल विलोचनाय नमः ओम चंद्रिका श्री मंडिताय मंडलाय नमः। ओम सूदवाक्यां समासीनाय नमः। ओम सूर्यदाख्य विप्रमाय नमः। ओम वेद वेदांत तत्वज्ञाय नमः। ओम चिन्मुद्रिणे नमः। ओम श्री गुणाधिवाय नमः। ओम विरूपाक्ष भुवावासाय नमः। ओम विराज दशरामृत्ये नमः। ओम उच्चित्तनयनाय नमः। ओम पूर्णाय नमः। ओम रसिदासतांडवाय नमः। ओम गंभीराय नमः। ओम परमाचार्याय नमः। ओम सुब्रतन्याय नमः। ओम अभयप्रदाय नमः। ओम दक्षिणासी निवाय नमः। ओम धीराय नमः। ओम दक्षिणाभिमुखाय नमः। ओम स्वराजे नमः। ओम महर्षिये नमः। ओम भगवते नमः। ओम ईश्याय नमः। ओम भूमविद्या विशारदाय नमः। ओम विमलाय नमः। ओम दीर्घदर्शने नमः। ओम आप्ताय नमः। ओम रुजमार्ग प्रदर्शकाय नमः। ओम समदृशे नमः। ओम सत्यदृशे नमः। ओम सत्याय नमः। ओम प्रसादाय नमः। ओम अमित विक्रमाय नमः। ओम सुकुमाराय नमः। ओम सदानंदाय नमः। ओम मृदुभाषणे नमः। ओम दयानवाय नमः। ओम श्री सोणासुर निरुपूर स्कंदासन निवेदनाय नमः। ओम सद्दर्शनोपदेशने नमः। ओम सद्भक्तवृंद परिवृताय नमः। ओम गणेश मुनिप्रियेण सेवितां कुशलोरुवाय नमः। ओम गीतोपदेश सारादि ग्रंथ संचिन्न सत्याय नमः। ओम वर्णात्मक मदादीनाय नमः। ओम रसज्ञाय नमः। ओम सौम्याय नमः। ओम आत्मवदे नमः। ओम सर्वावधि मनस्काना मानात्याय नमः। ओम सर्वसत्कुलिने नमः। ओम आत्मारामाय नमः। ओम महाभागाय नमः। ओम मातृमुक्ति विदायनाय नमः। ओम विनदाय नमः। ओम विनुदाय नमः। ओम विप्राय नमः। ओम मुनिन्द्राय नमः। ओम बाबगोत्पलाय नमः। ओम दर्शनागत सम्मानने नमः। ओम मौनेन स्वप्नबोधकाय नमः। ओम विद्यान्तिकर्षादित्याय नमः। ओम प्रणाद्वंद मोचकाय नमः। ओम अंतःक्रिय दंडांशवे नमः। ओम संसारानंद तारकाय नमः। ओम गुणादिवि अविदुष्टवे नमः। ओम आत्मविद्या प्रकाशकाय नमः। ओम अविच्युत विचक्रणाय नमः। ओम नैसर्गिक महातोषे नमः। ओम कमंडलुराय नमः। ओम सुब्रगवी नमस्नाय नमः। ओम भुवाय नमः। ओम दंडवाणिये नमः। ओम कृपापूर्णाय नमः। ओम पौरोगपिशपराय नमः। ओम स्कंदाय नमः। ओम देवदमाय नमः। ओम अमर्त्याय नमः। ओम तेनाग्न्ये नमः। ओम पुरुषोत्तमाय नमः। ओम नमो भगवते श्री अरुणाचल श्री रमणाय नमः। ओम नमो भगवते श्री अरुणाचल श्री रमणाय नमः। ओम नमो भगवते श्री अरुणाचल श्री रमणाय नमः। ओम नमो भगवते श्री कार्तिकाय नमः। ओम नमो भगवते श्री मुरुगाय नमः। ओम नमो भगवते श्री वल्ली देवाय नमः। ओम नमो भगवते श्री सुब्रमण्याय नमः। ओम नमो भगवते श्री स्वामीनाथने नमः। ओम नमो भगवते श्री दक्षिणामूर्तये नमः। ओम नमो भगवते श्री दक्षाधरे नमः। ओम नमो भगवते श्री भैरवरे नमः। ओम नमो भगवते श्री नंदीमहेश्वराय नमः। ओम नमो भगवते श्री शिव पार्वतीये नमः। हरि ओम हरि ओम हरि ओम। The Lord recites Upadesha Sara. कस्तुराज्ञया प्रापदे फलम् कर्म जिम्बरम् कर्म तज्जडम् सृष्टि महतो पतन कारणम् फलम शाश्वतम् गद निरोधकम् ईश्वरात्मिकम् नेष्टयाकृतम् सिद्धशोधकम् मुक्तिसाधकम् कार्यवामन कार्यमुत्तमम् भूतनं नव चिन्तनं क्रमा गतैषधी युक्तसेवनम् अष्टमूर्तिभिः देवमूर्धनम् उत्तमस्तवा उद्यमं जगत् सिद्धयं जगत् ध्यानमुद्गमम् आद्यध्यारया श्रोतसागमम् सरलचिन्तनम् निरनरबरम् वेदभावना सौवमित्यसौ भावनाविदा भावनीमता भावशून्यस भावसुस्तुति भावनाबला भक्तिरुद्गमा तिरुष्करे मन स्वस्थता क्रिया भक्तियोग बोधाचिदम् वायुरोधना दीयते मन जालभक्षिव रोधसाधनम् सिद्धवायव क्रियायुधा सागयोद्वै शक्तिमूलगा लयविनाशने उभयरोदने लयकदं पुनः भवति नो हृदम् प्राणबन्धना लीनमागतम् एकचिन्तना नासमेत्यद नष्टमानसो निष्ठयोगिन कृत्यमस्ति किं स्वस्तिदं यद दृश्यवारितं सिद्धमात्मन सिद्वदर्शनं तत्त्वदर्शनं मानसं दुःखिं मार्गणे हृदे नैव मानसं मार्गाचवा वृद्धयस्वहं वृद्धिमाश्रिता वृद्धयो मनो विद्यां अहमयं कुतो भवति चिन्वद ऐपदत्यहं निजविचारणम् अहमिनासभा यमहं गया पुरतीरस्वयं परमपूर्णस इदमहं वदा अभिख्यमन्वहम् अहमिदीनके अप्यल्लसत्तया विक्रये प्रिय प्राणतीर्थम धामसे कथ दक्षिणं श्रित तत्त्वभासिका चित्त्ववेदरा तद्दया इति सिद्धया जगम् ईशजीवयो वेशति पिता तत्स्वभावतो वस्तु केवलम् वेश आनद स्वात्मदर्शनम् ईशदर्शनम् स्वात्मरूपत आत्मसंस्थिति स्वात्मदर्शनम् आत्मनिर्भया आत्मनिष्ठता ज्ञानवर्जिता अज्ञानहीनति ज्ञानमस्ति किं ज्ञातुमन्तरम् किं स्वरूपमे आत्मदर्शने अव्यया भवा पूर्णचित्सुखम् बन्धमुक्त्यदि संवरं सुखम् विन्ददीयै विवस्तु दैविक अहमवेदकम् निजविमाननम् महति तत्त्वो रमणवाभ्यम् महति तत्त्वो रमणवाभ्यम् महति तत्त्वो रमणवाभ्यम् ओम नमः शिवाय।
Narayanji, thank you so much. Mr. Michael James, who will be delivering the talk today needs very little introduction. He has been with us last month, and most of us have read his works at various points in time. But still, as a formal introduction, let me introduce him once again. He had started his spiritual journey at Thiruvannamalai about uh, in the year 1976. He stayed on there for over 20 years and had a long friendship and association with Sri Sadhu Om, and assisted him in translating number of works of Bhagwan into English. Mr. Michael James is now based in London, where he regularly discusses Bhagwan's teachings with fellow devotees through email and Zoom, and focuses primarily on explaining Bhagwan's original Tamil writings. Mr. Michael James, may I please request you to now take over, sir?
Namaskaram. Today I'm going to talk about the central role that ego plays in Bhagavan's teachings. In older Advaita texts and commentaries, the root problem identified is avidya or maya. But Bhagavan goes a bit deeper. Bhagavan says the root problem is ego. Obviously, Bhagavan is not contradicting what he said in the older text, but he's shifting the emphasis. As I say, he's going deeper. And also he's presenting the Advaita philosophy, not only in a much simpler and deeper and clearer way, but also in a much more practical way. And what he talks about ego is central to this. That is, why he's not contradicting, because it is true, avidya or maya is the problem. But for whom is avidya? For whom is maya? It is only for ourselves as ego. Avidya is and maya actually the very nature of ego. What does avidya mean? Avidya means ignorance of our real nature. That is the very nature of ego. That is, as Bhagavan explained, ego is that false awareness, but it's always aware of itself as I am this body. So long as we're aware, since this body is not what we actually are, so long as we're aware of ourselves as I am this body, we are ignorant of what we actually are. So avidya is the very nature of ego. But if we talk about avidya, it seems to be something other than ourself. Whereas Bhagavan focuses on who is it who has this avidya? That is ourself as ego. So, and likewise, Maya. Maya means, well, as Bhagavan explained, Bhagavan gave a very nice explanation of Maya. It may not be the original etymology, but he explained it as an etymology. That is, Maya means ya ma. Ya means is a feminine form of what, and ma means not. So what is not, or she who is not, that is Maya. So Maya doesn't actually exist. But Maya is a term that is used to refer to all this multiplicity. All this multiplicity is just a delusion. To whom does it all appear? Only to ourselves as ego. In sleep, when we don't rise as ego, there's no avidya, no maya, nothing, no problem at all. It's only when we rise as ego in waking and dream, but this avidya and maya and everything comes into existence. Here also, Bhagavan has slightly, his analysis goes slightly deeper than the older text, because according to Bhagavan, sleep is not a state of ignorance, it's a state of pure awareness. Ignorance comes into existence only when we rise as ego. Without ego, there's no ignorance. So sleep is just a state of pure awareness. I will now, to illustrate what a central role ego plays in Bhagavan's teachings, I will explain how ego is actually the main topic throughout Uludu Napadu. in most of the verses of Uludunapadu, Bhagavan is either talking explicitly or implicitly about ego. Bhagavan wrote Uludunapadu in answer to the request of Muruggana. What Muruggana asked Bhagavan, this is as it says it in his Payaram or introductory verse. The question what he asked Bhagavan is, Mayin ilbum ademevam tiranam viyambadi emaku odaha. That means, so that we may be saved, reveal to us the nature of reality and the means to attain it, or reach it, or join it. So the subject of Uludunapadu is the nature of reality and the means by which to attain it. However, though Uludunapadu is about Uludu, the reality, what actually exists, what Bhagavan focuses on is the means to attain it. Because why, if Uludu is what is, and that is what we actually are, then why do we not experience ourselves as that? So what we need to know is how to attain that. And first we need to know what is the obstacle and how to overcome that obstacle. The obstacle, as Bhagavan says, is our rising as ego. How to overcome it is what he explains in Uludunapadu. So ego is the central theme running throughout most of the verses of Uludunapadu. I will, before concentrating on verses 23 to 26, which are the central verses dealing with the nature of ego, I will first give a brief overview of how Bhagavan is referring to ego, either directly or indirectly, in most of the verses. In the very first verse, Bhagavan begins, Nam Ulahum Kandalal, because we see the world. So who is that Nam, that we who see the world? That is only ego. It's only when we rise as ego in waking and dream that we see a world. In sleep, when we don't rise as ego, there is no world. So the very first word of the main text of Uludunapadu, Nam, which means we, is referring to ego, ourself as ego. Only when we rise as ego are we seeing the world. So in this first verse, he says, because we see the world, accepting one fundamental that has a power that becomes many is certainly the one best option. The picture of names and forms, the one who sees, the cohesive scream and the pervading light, all these are he who is oneself. So in this second sentence, Papanam, the one who sees, that is also referring to ego. So in this first verse, Bhagavan is beginning to touch upon ego. In the next two verses, he reveals the aim of Uludunapadu. The aim of Uludunapadu is not just to teach us a philosophy, but we can argue with others about. The aim of the Uludunapadu is to get rid of ego, as he implies in these two verses. In verse 2, he says, each religion initially accepts three fundamentals, that is the world, soul, and God. And then he says, contending only one fundamental stands as the three fundamentals, or three fundamentals are always actually three fundamentals, is only so long as ego exists. Destroying I, standing in the state of oneself is best. So here Bhagavan says all disputes between different religions and different philosophies and so on, or in fact, all disputes, they can take place only so long as we rise as ego. Therefore, destroying this ego and standing in our natural state, that is the best option. And similarly, in the third verse, he says, what is the use of disputing? The world is real. No, it's an unreal appearance. The world is sentient. It is not. The world is happiness. It is not. Leaving the world and investigating oneself, thereby bringing about the cessation of the distinction between one and two, that state in which I has perished is agreeable to all. So again, here he's talking about the state in which the ego is annihilated. That is what we are all indirectly seeking. That is, we're all seeking happiness, and the happiness that we're seeking can be attained only when this ego is annihilated. In verse 4, he begins to go deeper. He begins to talk about what the actual problem is. He begins verse 4 by saying, Uruvum tanayin ulhu paramatran. That is, if oneself is a form, the world and God will be likewise. If oneself is not a form, who can see their forms and how? Can what is seen be otherwise than the eye? The eye means he's using eye here, that is EYE, as an analogy for awareness. So can what is seen be other than can the nature of what is seen be otherwise than the nature of the seer, is the implication. That is, if the seer is a form, everything that is seen will also seem to be forms. If the seer is formless, everything will be formless. And then he concludes by saying, the I, again, EYE, kan, is oneself, the infinite I. What is here, as I say, I mean is a metaphor for awareness. So what this implies is that awareness, that is the real awareness, is oneself, the infinite awareness. What is infinite? Forms are all finite. So whatever is infinite is formless. So our real nature is formless awareness, and therefore it never sees forms. It's only when we rise as ego and identify ourselves with the form of a body that we see the world and God as forms. When we don't rise as ego, all forms disappear and only pure infinite awareness remains. So when he says in the first clause, Ururum Tanayin, if oneself is a form, what he's referring to is ego. Here is ego, because it's only when we rise as ego that we identify ourselves as a form. We experience ourselves as a form of this body only when we've risen as ego. So here he's indirectly referring to ego. In the next verse, because he said ego is it's nothing but the false awareness, I am this body, he explains what he means by the term body. This is a very important verse. That is, generally, when we talk about body, we think about the physical form. But here, Bhagavan goes deeper. He says, Udul Panchakosa Uru. The body is a form of 5 sheaths. Therefore, all 5 are included in the term body. Without a body, is there a world? Say, leaving the body, is there anyone who has seen a world? That is, again, he's emphasizing here, only when we experience ourselves as a body do we see this world of names and forms. So why does he say the body is a form of 5 sheaths? If we talk about the body objectively, it's just a physical form. But Bhagavan is here talking from the perspective of ego. As ego, we identify this body as I. But when we identify this body as I, we never identify a dead body as I. It's always a living body as I. So there's not only the Annamaya Kosha, the gross physical form of the body, there's also the Pranamaya Kosha, the life that animates that body. We also don't ever experience a sleeping body as I. Whenever we experience ourselves with a body, we seem to be awake. So when we're awake, there's also mind, intellect, and will. So these 5, the physical form of the body, Annamaya Kosha, the life, Pranamaya Kosha, the mind, Manomaya Kosha, the intellect, Vijnanamaya Kosha, and the will, or Chittam, the Anandamaya Kosha. These, we experience all these collectively as ourself. So when we say I am a body, we're not referring just to the physical form of the body, we're referring to all these 5 sheaths. And whenever we experience ourselves as a body, in other words, whenever we rise as ego, we experience all 5 of these. We never experience one or more without the others. We experience them all collectively as ourself. So he's here defining what he means by body. And he said that only when we identify, or he implies, only when we identify ourselves with a body do we see a world. In other words, only when we rise as ego, because it's only as ego that we identify ourselves as a body. In verse 6, he says, Uluhu I'm Pulankol Uru Verandru. The world is a form of 5 sense impressions, not anything else. That is what we take to be the world. We generally believe that there's some world existing outside ourselves, but we are perceiving. But what Bhagavan says here is what we call the world is actually nothing but a collection of 5 kinds of sense impressions: sights, sounds, tastes, smells, and tactile sensations. Remove these 5, and where is any world? So the world, as we know it, is nothing but these 5 kinds of sense impressions. So these 5, I mean, he goes on to say, those 5 sense impressions are impressions to the 5 sense organs. Since the mind alone perceives the world by way of the 5 sense organs, say, is there a world besides the mind? What he refers to here as mind is ego, because as he explains in verse 18 of Upadesha Undiyar, the term mind is often used as a collective term to refer to all thoughts. All thoughts collectively are the mind. But of all the thoughts that rise in the mind, the root is only the first thought, I. That is what he refers to there as the thought called I, is what he otherwise refers to as ego. That is, ego is nothing but a thought, and it's the first of all thoughts. So though the term mind is often used as a collective term to refer to all the thoughts, what the mind essentially is this I. Why is that? Because all other thoughts are objects perceived by us, whereas ego, the thought called I, is the perceiver. So when he says here, since the mind alone perceives the world, what he's referring to is ego, which is the perceiving element of the mind. It's not other thoughts that perceive the world, it's only ego that perceives the world. So here he's saying, but the world doesn't exist besides, he said, he asked it as a rhetorical question, is there a world besides the mind? Like in the previous verse, he also asked a rhetorical question. The implication is, no, there is no world besides the mind. That is, it's only in the view of the mind that the world seems to exist. The mind here meaning ego. So here also he's referring to ego. Then in verse 7, he uses 2 terms, uluhu and arivu. The arivu he's referring to in this verse, arivu means aware, uluhu means the world, arivu means awareness. The awareness he's referring to in this verse is the ego, because he talks about it arising and subsiding, or appearing and disappearing. The awareness that rises and subsides is only ego. So what he says in this verse is, though the world and awareness rise and subside simultaneously, the world shines by awareness. As I say, here awareness is referring to ego, the perceiver of the world. So though the world and ego rise and subside simultaneously, the world shines only by ego. It's the implication. What he means by the world shines only by ego, it's only in the view of ego that world seems to exist. So without ego, there would be no world. But then he said, then in the next sentence, he says very nicely, only that which shines without appearing and disappearing, as the place for the appearing and disappearing of the world and awareness is the substance, which is the whole. The term he uses here for substance is porul, which is a Tamil equivalent of the Sanskrit word vastu. That means the real substance, what actually exists. So what actually exists, the real substance that appears as all this, is only that which shines without appearing and disappearing as the place or the base for the appearing and disappearing of the world and awareness. What he's referring to here, what is it that shines without appearing and disappearing? It is only the fundamental awareness that is always shining in our heart as I am. That is our fundamental awareness of our own existence. In other words, Sat-Chit. So that is what he refers to here, is that which shines without ever appearing and disappearing. That is the one thing we are always aware of is I am. Ego and the world appear in waking and dream, but disappear in sleep. But even in the absence of ego in sleep, we are still aware of ourselves as I am. So that fundamental awareness of our own existence, I am, is that which shines without appearing and disappearing. And as he says, that is Poro, that is Vastu, that is the Mayporo, the real substance, what actually exists. And that is Pundram. He uses Pundram is a Tamil form of the Sanskrit word Purna. It's the infinite whole, the unlimited whole. So that alone is what is real, he points out here. Then in verse 8, he talks about whether that substance is the substance that he refers to in verse 7. Is it a name and form, or is it formless? Well, the fact he says it's the indicated, but it's the infinite whole means it's formless. So what he says in this verse is, whoever worships in whatever form, giving whatever name, that is the way to see that substance in name and form. The term he uses here for in name and form is per uruvil. We can interpret, because he says per uruvil ap porole, per uruvil can mean per uruvilada, that means without name and form, or nameless and formless. So we could interpret it here to be an adjective describing the substance, the nameless and formless substance. But it's more appropriate here to take the ill to be the locative case ending to mean in name and form. Yes, that porul is nameless and formless, but what he's talking about here is if we worship it in name and form, that's a way to see it in name and form. But that is not the real seeing, because as he says in the next sentence, ayinum means however. Investigating the reality of oneself, dissolving in the reality of that true substance, becoming one alone is seeing in reality. That is only when we turn our attention within to investigate the reality of ourselves and thereby dissolve in the reality of that that true substance. In other words, in that pure awareness I am, that alone is seeing in reality. So he's contrasting in these two sentences. In the first sentence, he's talking about seeing in name and form. In this second sentence, he's talking about seeing in reality. That is, in the first sentence, it's Peruruvilkan, seeing in name and form. In here, he's talking about unmeil kanal, seeing in reality. So this is the contrast here. So who is it who sees who can see the reality? And it's referring indirectly to God in name and form. It's only as ego that we can see God in name and form, as he said in verse 4. But to see him in reality, we as ego need to dissolve, we need to investigate ourselves and thereby dissolve back in to our own reality, which is that real substance, pure awareness, the fundamental awareness I am. So here indirectly, he's referring to ego here. In verse 9, he again talks about ego more directly. What he says here is, he talks about dyads and triads. Dyads here means pairs of opposites. That is existence, non-existence, awareness, non-awareness, happiness, unhappiness, knowledge, ignorance, life, death, etc. So all these pairs of opposites is what he refers to as dyads, and triads means triputi, the three factors of objective knowledge. Whenever we know something other than ourselves, we are the subject, the knower, but what we know is the object, what is known, and there's the act of knowing it. So these three, the knower, the knowing, and the known, these are what are called triputi or triad. So Bhagavan said all these dyads and triads exist always holding one thing. So the word he uses for one thing is ondru. What is that ondru? What is that one thing that upon which all these dyads and triads depend? it is only ego. That's only as when we rise as ego do dyads and triads come into existence. So though he doesn't use the word ego here, it's what he implies. And he explained this very clearly to Lakshman Sharma, who's written it in his Tamil commentary. Some people have misinterpreted this verse as that one thing is the reality. That is not what he means here. That is the real self. That's not what he's talking here about ego. It's only when we rise as ego that dyads and triads come into existence. And so in the next sentence he says, if one sees within the mind what that one thing is, they will cease to exist. So that one thing on which dyads and triads, it exists within the mind. That's the mind in a collective sense. That one thing is ego. If we investigate ego, ego will disappear and dyads and triads will cease to exist along with it. That is the implication here. And then he says, only those who have seen thus have seen the reality. See, they will not be confused. Then in verses 10 to 11, 10 to 13, these 4 verses, he's talking about, he's analyzing knowledge, about knowledge and ignorance. And indirectly, he's referring to ego here. He says, for instance, in verse 10, only the knowledge that knows oneself. Here oneself in this, only the knowledge that knows oneself who is the first, as to whom are that knowledge and ignorance is knowledge. So to whom are knowledge and ignorance? It's only to ego. Knowledge and ignorance are one of the dyads. So to whom are knowledge and ignorance? It's only to ego. So he's indirectly referring to ego. So when he says only the knowledge that knows oneself, he means the knowledge that knows the reality of ego. Only the awareness that is aware of the reality of ego, that is the pure awareness I am, is real knowledge, he says here in verse 10. In verse 11, he says, not knowing oneself who knows. Here, oneself who knows, Arivarum Tanne, refers to ego. It's the ego that knows all other things. So not knowing oneself who knows, knowing other things is ignorance. Besides, is it knowledge? When one knows oneself, the support for knowledge and the other, again here, oneself means ego, knowledge and ignorance will cease. In verse 12, he says, what is completely devoid of knowledge and ignorance is actually knowledge. Knowledge here means awareness, it's real awareness. So only the awareness that is devoid of knowledge and ignorance of other things is real awareness. That which knows is not real knowledge. Here he's referring to ego. That which knows means that which knows other things is not real knowledge. That ego is not real knowledge. Since one shines without another for knowing or causing to know, oneself is knowledge. Knowledge here is used in the sense of awareness. So the real awareness is only that which shines without any other for knowing or not knowing. I mean, he says that it is not a void. It is not sunyam. And in verse 13, he begins by saying, Jnanamam tane me, oneself who is awareness alone is real. Nanavam jnanam ajnanamam, knowledge which is manifold or many or various is ignorance. The awareness that is what he's referring to here, Nanavam jnanam, in an earlier version of this verse, he wrote it as Nanavaikam Kendra jnanam, that is the knowledge which sees as many. So as ego, we see the one real substance as all this multiplicity. So what he refers to here is as Nanavam jnanam or Nanavaikam Kendra jnanam is ego. Ego is the false awareness that sees all this, or that sees the one as all this. So therefore, ego is ignorance. But then he says, even ignorance, that is, he's referring here to ego as ignorance, even ignorance, which is unreal, does not exist except as oneself who is awareness. So that even though this ego is ignorance, because ego is that which is aware of itself as I am this body, and which is therefore aware of the semi-existence of other things, that doesn't exist apart from oneself who is awareness. Oneself who is awareness is the pure awareness I am. So ego cannot exist apart from I am. I mean, he compares it using the analogy of ornaments and gold. all the many ornaments are unreal. Say, do they exist except as gold, which is real? So what he's asserting here is the substance alone is real. The forms are unreal. They're just an appearance. So again, he's referring indirectly to ego here. In the next verse, he talks about ego very explicitly. Though he doesn't use the word ego, he refers to ego as the first person, tanmay. And he says, what he says here is what he again later says in verse 26, but he says it in a different way here. If the first person exists, second and third persons will exist. Here, first person means ego, the perceiver, the subject. Second and third persons means everything other than ego, everything which is perceived by ego. So when he says if the first person exists, second and third person will exist. That is, if we rise as the perceiver or subject, then objects will seem to exist. Things that we will seem to, it's only when we rise as this ego, whose nature is to perceive things other than itself, but other things will seem to exist. Then he says, if one's self-investigating the reality of the first person ceases to exist, second and third persons will come to an end, and the nature that then shines as one alone is oneself, the state of oneself. So the one thing that shines after the first person and second person cease to, first, second, and third persons all cease to exist, that is what we actually are. So this first, in order to bring about the cessation of the second and third persons, we need to bring about the cessation of the first person, because so long as the first person exists, the second and third person will exist. So how to bring about the cessation of the first person, the ego? Only by investigating the reality of it. So he says, tanmayin unmeye tanaindu. So that is oneself investigating the reality of the first person. That is, what is this ego? What actually is this ego? What is the reality underlying this ego? The reality underlying the ego is nothing but the pure awareness I am. Ego is the mixed awareness I am this body. The reality of it is only the awareness I am. So I've gone through the first 14 verses now and shown how he's referring to ego in almost every verse. I will not go through each and every verse now because it'll take too long, but I'll skip on now to, I mean, indirectly both of them is referring to ego in most of these verses, but now I'll skip on to verse 19. In verse 19, he says, in the first sentence, Vidimati mulam vidimati mula vivekam ilake, vidimati vellam vivadam. That means only for those who do not have discernment of the fate, of the root of fate and will, is there the dispute about which prevails, fate or will. This is the old thing about the dispute between free will and destiny. Which prevails. Bhagavan says such a dispute is only for those who do not have discernment of the root of fate and will. So what is the root of fate and will? It is only, though he doesn't explicitly say it here, it implies ego, because it's only when we rise as ego, but we have a will, and we like this and dislike that, and we try to attain all the things we like and to avoid the things we dislike. So we act according to our will. But what we experience is our destiny. The fruit of our misuse of our will in previous lives is what we now experience. So our will and the will and fate are both only for ego. It is ego that does agamya. Agamya means actions that we do by our own will. And what we experience for prarabdha, that is the fruit of those actions. So which prevail? Neither prevails over the other, because they're two entirely separate domains. Will is what, that is, fate cannot make us want anything but we don't want. We are, and that is what we want is not going to, we can want to experience anything, but it's not going to change what we are to experience, because what we are to experience is determined by fate. But just because we are destined to experience something doesn't stop us wanting to experience something else. So the domain of will is what we want to experience. The domain of fate is what we are to experience. These are two separate domains. So neither can intrude into the domain of the other. Fate cannot make us want anything that we don't want, and our will cannot change what we are destined to experience. So, but the root of both of these, for who is it who has this will? Who is it who is experiencing this fate? It is only I as ego. So he's referring here to ego. So he then goes on to say, those who have known themselves, who is the one origin of fate and will, have discarded them. The one origin for fate and will, again, here he uses the term mudra, meaning origin. It can also mean root. Again, it is ego. When we know the reality of ego, we thereby free ourselves from ego and thereby discard both fate and will. Say, will they thereafter be associated with them? So here Bhagavan is very clearly, like in all these verses, Bhagavan is constantly stressing that ego is the root of all these things. It's the root of knowledge and ignorance, of fate and will, of perception of the world. It's the root of everything. Then in verse 20, he says, in verse 20, 21, and 22, the subject is about seeing God. And he begins by saying, karnam tane vittu, leaving oneself who sees. Oneself who sees means ego. So leaving oneself who sees, oneself seeing God is seeing a mental vision, a manomayamam kakshi. Leaving oneself here means ignoring oneself. In other words, instead of trying to see what oneself is, trying to see God, and even if one succeeds in seeing God, one's seeing only a mental vision. And then he says, only one who sees oneself, the origin of oneself, is one who has seen God. Because the origin oneself is not other than God. Here, Bhagavan is using the word, the Tamil word tan, which means oneself, but he's using it both to refer to ourself as we actually are and ourself as ego. So we need to understand when he says only one who sees oneself, he's meaning what we actually are. Then he refers to oneself as the origin of oneself. That means the origin of ego. So only one who sees one's real nature, the origin of ego, is one who has seen God, is the implication. Because the origin, that's our real nature. No, sorry, because ego, which is the origin of everything else, going once. When ego goes, oneself is not other than God. So it's a complicated sentence, but it's actually very, very deep in meaning. So we need to understand which, when he's referring to our real nature and when he's referring to ego. So this verse is about ego. That is, he's identifying here the problem is ego. Likewise, in the next verse, he says, if one asks the truth of what is the truth of many texts that say oneself seeing oneself and seeing God. So, if one asks what is the truth of many texts that say oneself seeing oneself and seeing God, he then gives the answer to that. Since oneself is one, how is oneself to see oneself? If it is not possible to see oneself, how to see God? Then he provides the answer, Unadal Khan. Unadal Khan means becoming food is seeing. Becoming food here means only when the ego is swallowed by God, is what it implies. So only when who is it who wants to see God? It is only as ego that we want to see God. But if we want to see God, we have to be swallowed by God. Only when we are swallowed by God and thereby become one with God are we really seeing God, because God is nothing other than our real nature. But we cannot see God as he actually is, so long as we rise his ego and thereby take ourselves to be this body. So in all these verses, he's indirectly referring to ego. And in the next verse, he uses the word mati. Mati here refers to the mind or ego. In verse 19, he used mati in the sense of will, but here he's using mati in the sense of more generally of mind, and particularly in the sense of ego. Because as I said, ego is the perceiving element of the mind. So what the mind essentially is ego. So what he says in this verse is, it's a very beautiful verse. Mati koli tandu, mati kul olirum, mati ne ulle matiki, patiel, padutital andri, patie, patial, padutital engan mati. What that means is, consider, except by turning the mind back within, completely immersing it in pati. Pati means God or the Lord, who shines within that mind, giving light to the mind, how to fathom God by the mind. So pati, as I say, it's a term that refers to God or the Lord, but he said that it is that which shines within the mind, giving light to the mind. In other words, he's referring to our real nature, the pure awareness I am. So what illumines the ego is the ego is a mixed awareness. I am this body. What illumines the ego and enables it to know other things is only the light of pure awareness, which is what shines in it as I. So in order to know to know God, we need to turn our mind back within and drown ourselves in that. In other words, we need to be swallowed by God. Then only we are truly knowing God. Then from 23 to 26, Bhagavan talks about the nature of ego. I'll come to these verses after going through a few of the later verses, because these are the heart of what Bhagavan teaches. In verse 27, Bhagavan says, "Nadnu diyada ullanilai, na madhuvai ullanilai." That means the state in which one exists without rising as I is the state in which we exist as that. In other words, in order to be aware of ourselves as I am Brahman, we need to avoid rising as I. In other words, the I that rises is ego. So it's only when we cease rising as ego are we in the state in which we are that. And then he says, without investigating the place where I rises, that means the place where ego rises. From where does ego rise? It rises only from ourself, our real nature. So without investigating that place, here he's using place obviously in a metaphorical sense, not in a literal sense. So without investigating the source, we can say, from which I rises, in other words, the pure awareness that we actually are, how to reach the annihilation of oneself in which I does not rise. Here oneself means ego. So how to bring about the annihilation of ego unless we investigate the source from which ego rises. The source from which ego rises is only the fundamental awareness I am. And then he says in the last sentence, without reaching, say, how to stand in the state of oneself in which oneself is that. So merely by saying I am that, we can't experience ourselves as Brahman. By saying I am Brahman, we don't experience ourselves as Brahman. In order to experience ourselves as Brahman, we need to bring about the cessation of the rising of ego. And in order to bring about the cessation of the rising of ego, we need to investigate ourselves. Because only when we investigate ourselves does ego subside and dissolve forever in its source. We can bring about the permanent dissolution of ego, in other words, manonasa, the destruction of ego, annihilation or eradication of ego, only by self-investigation is what he implies here. In verse 28, he says, like sinking, wanting to know something to see something that has fallen in water, sinking within, restraining speech and breath by a sharpened mind, kundamati, it is necessary to know the place where the rising ego rises. Again, here he's using the term place metaphorically to mean the source, or the source from which ego rises is only the pure awareness. So How do we restrain the speech and breath? Only by a kondamati. This kondamati is the instrument by which we turn within to investigate and know what we actually are. That same sharpened mind will bring about the restraint of speech and breath. So it's not necessary to restrain the speech and breath separately. If we turn our mind keenly within to know what we actually are, to know the source from which this ego has risen, speech and breath are thereby automatically restrained. So here also he's talking about, he's explicitly talking about ego here. He says, Erumba Mahande, the rising ego, Erumba Mahande, Erumidate, the place or source from which the rising ego rises. That is what we need to know. And in verse 29, he says, again, he's talking, in all these verses, he's talking about the practice. Not saying I by mouth, investigating with an inward sinking mind. Mind here means the power of attention. Where one rises as I, alone is the jnana neri, the path of knowledge. Instead, thinking not I am not this, I am that, is an aid, but is it vichara? No, it's not, is the implication. And then in verse 30, he says, as soon as the mind reaches the heart, inwardly investigating who am I, when he who is I dies, he who is I means ego, when ego dies, one thing appears spontaneously as I am I. Though it appears, it is not I, ego, I that appears and disappears. It is the entire substance, the substance that is oneself. Again, here he's using the word pundrap porol, the substance that is the whole, the infinite whole. And he said tanam porol, the substance that is oneself. That is what we actually are. In verse 30, he talks, 31, sorry, that was 30. He says, he talks about tanne aritu, the destruction of oneself, or destroying oneself. Oneself here obviously means the ego. So what he says in this verse is, for those who are tanmayananda, happiness composed of that, which rose destroying themselves, what one thing exists for doing? They do not know anything other than themselves. So who can conceive their status like this? So again, here he's referring, only when the ego is destroyed do we experience tammayananda, happiness, which is our own real nature. And other verses, he also touches upon ego here and there, but I won't go through them in detail until verse 38. In verse 38, he says, Vine model nam ayin, vile payan tu pom. If we are the doer of actions, we will experience the resulting fruit. So who is the doer of actions? It is only ego. Why? Because all actions, all karma is done by mind, speech, and body. These are the three instruments of action. So long as we rise as ego, we experience this mind and body as ourself. So whatever actions are done by the mind, speech, or body, we experience them as actions done by me. So these are the doer of action is ego. That is, ego is, because as ego, we identify ourselves with the instruments of action, we experience the actions as done by ourselves. So long as when he says, if we have a doer of action, he implies if we rise as ego, we will inevitably do actions according to our will, and consequently we will experience the fruit. That is the implication there. And then he says, when one knows oneself by investigating who is the doer of action, doership will depart and all three actions will slip off. What this means is when we investigate ourselves to find out who is the doer of action, in other words, who am I, this ego who rises as I am a doer, when the nature of ego is such, when we investigate it, it subsides and disappears. Then we know our real nature. And when we know our real nature, we will know that we were never the doer of any action. So doership will depart And along with doership, obviously experiencership, because it's only as ego that we experience ourselves as I am a doer and I am the experiencer of fruit. It's fruit. So doership will depart, and all three karmas, that is agamya, actions done by our will, sanchita, the fruit of those, store of the fruit of those actions, and prarabdha, those actions, the fruit that have been allotted for us to experience in this lifetime, all will slip off. That means all three karmas will be destroyed. This is the state of liberation, which is eternal. So here, Bhagavan is clearly talking about ego. In the next verse, also, he says, Bhatanan ennamate, only so long as one is aware of oneself as I am bound. So only so long as one says I am bound, thoughts of bondage and liberation exist. When one looks at oneself, who is the one who is bound, in other words, when one looks at ego, who is the one who is bound, and when oneself then oneself, the one who is eternally liberated, remains as accomplished. Thought of bondage will not remain, so thought of liberation will also not remain. So again, indirectly, he's referring here to ego as the one who is bound. And if we investigate this one who is bound, it will disappear, and what will remain is our own real nature, which is eternally liberated. And then he's referred there to liberate. I mean, he refers in both these 38 and 39 to the state of liberation. So in 40, he says, what is liberation? That is, the term mukti, or liberation, or moksha, is used in almost all systems of Indian philosophy, or Indian religion also. But what is mukti? There are so many different ideas people have. Some people think in the state of mukti, you still retain your individuality. You're in Vaikuntha or Kailasa with Vishnu or Shiva or wherever, and you still remain as having a form. So some people think liberation is a state in which you retain form. Some people think liberation is a formless state. And some people think that in the state of liberation, you're free to either take a form or to leave a form. So these are three types of liberation: with form, without form, or with or without form. So Bhagavan refers to this, and he says, if it is said that the liberation one will experience is of three kinds, with form, without form, or without form, I will say, he gives his verdict. His verdict is, Uruvum, Aruvum, Uruvaruvum. That is, with form, without form, or without form, Ayo Mahande, Uru, Aridal, Mukti. That is, know that destruction of the ego, which distinguishes liberation with form, without form, or with or without form, that alone is real liberation. In other words, Bhagavan's conclusion of ego, of Ullidunaptu, is that only annihilation of ego is liberation. So as I've explained, he's talking about ego throughout all these verses. But the verses in which he deals with the nature of ego most explicitly is in verses 23 to 26. But I seem to be, I may be running over my time a little. I will quickly go through these verses, and then I hope I'll be able to leave a little time for questions and answers. What he says in verse 23 is, ideham nan endru nabiladu. Nan endru ideham nabiladu. This body does not say I. Though he says say here, he's using say in a metaphorical sense. That is, what he implies is the body is not aware of itself as I. And here what he refers to as body is not just this physical form. All the five sheaves, none of the five sheaves are aware of themselves as I. So this body does not say I. Urakatum nan Indru, Endru Arum Nabil Padu Illay. That is, no one says, in sleep I did not exist. That is, even though the ego was absent in sleep, we are clearly aware that we existed in sleep. That's the implication here. Then he says, Nan Ondru Arindupin Elam Erum. After one thing called I, namely ego, rises, everything rises. And then his conclusion is, in Danan Engu Erum Endru Nun Matial En. Therefore, investigate with a keen or subtle intellect, a sharp, that means a keen power of attention, where this ego rises. In the Kali Vemba version of this verse, he extends this sentence and he says, when one investigates where this, with this sharp mind, where this ego rises, it will slip off. Then in verse 24, he says similarly, Jada udul nan enadu. This insentient body does not say I. That, in other words, the body is not aware of itself as I. Satchit udiadu. Satchit means being awareness or real awareness. It's referring to our awareness of our own existence, I am. So Satchit udiadu does not rise. So the body is not aware of itself as I, and Satchit doesn't rise. Ideal, udal alava nan ondru udikum ideal. That means in between one thing, I rises as the extent of the body. That in between here means in between the body and Satchit. Obviously, the body and Satchit are not two different things, because Satchit is the only real substance. So the body... Sorry? There was some other person talking there. Sorry. Okay, I'll continue. But the body cannot exist independent of Satchit. So there's no space between Satchit and the body for ego to rise. So he's using ideal in between here in a metaphorical sense. Why he uses this term ideal? Because what the I that rises between in between the body and Satchit is ego. Ego partakes of the qualities of the body and the qualities of Satchit. It usurps the qualities of both. So here in between means it is borrowing from both of them. It is neither the body nor is it Satchit, but it borrows the qualities of both. So that's what he means by ideal. It's neither this nor that, but something in between. It's a metaphorical use, in other words. So that what is this one thing I that rises between the body, that rises as the extent of the body? As the extent of the body means this I that rises, it limits itself to the extent of the body. That is, though it borrows awareness from Satchit, but it is aware of itself what? Not just as I am, but as I am this body. So it's limited to the extent of the body, which is what he means by udalalava. Is it udalalava udikum? It rises at the extent of the body. So what is this I? He says in the next sentence, idu. This, or that is idu chit jadagranti. This is the not formed by the entanglement of chit and jada. That is, the body is jada, Satchit is chit, is pure awareness. When these two are seemingly entangled together as I am this body, that is called chit jadagranti, but not but binds awareness and what is jada, or but is formed by the entanglement of these two. Of course, chit is never bound, but this knot is formed when they seem to be entangled. It's also bandham, bondage, jivan, the soul of an individual, nupame, the subtle body, ahande, ego, ichamsara, this samsara, and manam. So the ego is this false I. It's neither a body nor is it Satchit. It's that which rises in between, taking the awareness of Satchit and the limitations of the body and combining it together. This is the nature of ego. It's what he says here. Then in verse 25, he describes ego as uruvatrapeya hande, the formless phantom ego. It's formless because it has no form of its own. That is, it's not the body. And it's a phantom because it's got no substance of its own. It's not Satchit. It's neither the form nor the substance, but some spurious thing that arises between the two. So he describes it as a formless phantom ego. So how did this formless phantom ego come into existence? Well, he doesn't exactly say how it comes into existence. He describes what happens when it comes into existence and how it sustains itself. He says, Urupatriundam, grasping form, it comes into existence. That means grasping the form of a body as itself, it comes into existence. Urupatri nikum, grasping a form, it stands. That is only by taking this body to be I and thereby feeding on, grasping other forms, in other words, being aware of other forms, it stands. Urupatri undu mika ongum, grasping and feeding on forms, it flourishes abundantly. Uruvitu urupatram, leaving one form, it grasps another form. So the very nature of ego is to grasp form. Tedinal otum pidicum, that means if sought, it takes flight. Why is this? Because ego cannot stand without grasping a form as itself. If it tries to grasp itself, instead of grasping any form, if it tries to grasp itself, since it is a formless phantom, when it tries to grasp itself, it subsides and disappears. That's what he means by tedinal otum pidicum. This is the I said at the beginning, what Bhagavan puts emphasis on the ego, and this is very practical. This is the practical significance of why Bhagavan puts so much stress on ego, because in this verse he reveals what is the nature of ego. Ego rises, stands, and flourishes only by grasping form. It itself is formless. So forms are all things other than itself. That means by attending to anything other than itself, ego comes into existence, stands, and flourishes. But if it tries to attend to itself, if it tries to seek itself or grasp itself, it will subside and disappear. This is something that, as far as I'm aware, you can search all the vast ocean of Advaitic texts that existed before Bhagavan, and you will not find it said so clearly, but the nature of ego is to rise by grasping other things and stand and flourish by grasping other things, but to subside and disappear by grasping itself. In other words, the nature of ego is such, we seem to be ego so long as we're attending to other things. When we try to turn our attention back towards ourselves, this ego begins to dissolve and will subside back into and dissolve back into its source. This is the practical, the key to all of Bhagavan's teachings. If we understand this, all of Bhagavan's teachings fall into place. This is the most important clue he's given us. So this is why self-investigation is the only way to get rid of ego, because so long as we attend to anything other than ourselves, we are nourishing and sustaining ego. Only when we attend to ourselves are we bringing about the dissolution of ego. So in this verse, he says, the ego comes into existence grasping form. But does that mean that the forms exist there before ego comes into existence? No. We grasp form, we project and grasp the form, because as he says in verse 26, ahande undain anetum undaham. If ego comes into existence, everything comes into existence. That means the forms, all phenomena, they come into existence only when we rise as ego. Ahande indrail indru anatum. If ego doesn't exist, everything doesn't exist. Ahande yavamam. Ego itself is everything. Adalal yadu idu enjunadale overdal yavam en or. Therefore, investigating what this is giving up everything. Why is it giving up everything? Because everything depends for its seeming existence upon ego. When we investigate ego, ego will taden alotum pratikon. When sought, it takes flight. Ego will disappears as soon as we investigate, or if we investigate it keenly enough, it will dissolve back into its source, and thereby we are giving up everything. So only to the extent to which we are willing to let go of everything else will we be able to turn our attention back within to investigate this ego. And only when we are willing to let go of everything, in other words, when we're willing to surrender ourselves completely, will we finally be able to turn the full 180 degrees to face ourselves alone and thereby dissolve back into our source. So throughout all this, Bhagavan is talking about ego. He reveals the nature of ego is such that it rises and flourishes by attending to things other than itself. But it subsides and dissolves back into its source by attending to itself. So this is the means. Murana asks, Mayinilbum adu maven tiranum, and what is the nature of reality and the means of attaining it? This is the means of attaining it. So the whole of Ulunapru, it's an exposition on the nature of ego and the means to get rid of ego. And it's identifying ego throughout. Bhagavan is constantly identifying the root of all problems, whatever the problem may be, whether it's knowledge and ignorance or fate and will or the perception of the world or anything. The root of all these problems is only ego. So I've talked for a full hour now, I'm afraid. I don't know whether we are able to leave any time for questions or not.
Mr. James, we already have 3 questions for you in the chat box coming in from Meeraji and Rashmiji.
Okay.
May I request you to take them, while if any more questions come, you could also take them.
Okay, certainly. I will have a look. Sorry, it's a little difficult for me to read. I think it's Neera asked, you mentioned I thought as the perceiver aspect of the mind. Is this the sattvic aspect of the mind? How do we know when we're able to trace our thoughts to be I thought? That is, when I said the I thought is the perceiving aspect of the mind, that is, all other thoughts are objects perceived by us. The ego, or thought called I, as Bhagavan often referred to it, is the thought that is aware of all other thoughts. In other words, it's the thought that perceives all other thoughts. So in this sense, it is the perceiver aspect of the mind. The sattvic aspect of the mind is slightly different. What the mind essentially is, the mind or ego, what it essentially is just the pure awareness I am. What sattva means, sat means existence. Sattva means the existence-ness, or in other words, the beingness. In other words, it's the essential being nature of the mind. So the sattvic aspect of the mind is the pure awareness, I am this body. The pure awareness I am. Ego, or the thought called I, is the mixed awareness, I am this body. So in the I thought or ego, the essential I am aspect, that is the sattvic aspect of the mind. When we attach ourselves to adjuncts and thereby allow our attention to go outwards, that's how rajas and tamas comes into existence. That is, the tamas is when we take ourselves to be the body, that is tamas, because tamas means darkness. So we are, metaphorically speaking, we are concealing. Though we're always aware of ourselves as I am, we're not aware of ourselves as, we are not aware of we are aware that I am, but we're not aware what I am, because we now mistake ourselves to be, I am this body. So this, I am this body, that is tamas, and that leads to all mental activity, which is rajas. So the essential sattvic aspect of the mind is only that pure awareness I am. That is what we need to hold on to. And you ask, how do we know when we're able to trace our thoughts to the I thought? That is, this is not a difficult thing. We are aware, whatever other thoughts arise, who is aware of it? I am aware of it. So we have traced it back to I. Once we've traced it back to I, we have to hold on to this I. When we hold on to this I, Bhagavan said, holding on to ego is like the master, like a dog holding on to the scent of its master. The master may be far away, but the dog just holds on to the scent, and by following the scent, it's able to reach its master. So this ego, in this ego, there is the awareness I am. That is the scent. If we hold on to this I am, it will lead us back to our source, the pure I am. So tracing the other thoughts to ego, to I thought, is very easy, because we just have to think a little. Yes, to whom is this? It's to me. That is tracing it back to ego. But then we have to trace this ego back to its source. How do we trace the ego back to its source? By attending only to ego. The more we attend to ego, the more it subsides. The more it subsides, the closer we come to returning back to our source. So that is our aim, to return to not the ego we know already. The ego is bouncing around as I am Michael, or I am Neera, or whoever we take ourselves to be. That is ego. So finding ego is not difficult. We need to hold on to this ego, and it will lead us back to our source. In other words, we need to pierce through this ego back to the reality that lies behind ego, which is the pure awareness I am. We're always aware of that pure awareness I am. So there's nothing new to know. As Bhagavan said, attaining jnana is not a new knowledge. All we need to do is to get rid of the ajnana, get rid of the false knowledge. The false knowledge, the ajnana or avidya, is nothing but this false awareness, I am this body. Remove the adjunct, and what remains? The adjunct is this body. What remains is the pure awareness I am. That's why Bhagavan says in Upadesh Undiyar, in verse in verse 25 of Upadesh Undiyar, he says, Tane upadi bitu ovadu, tan isan tane unuvadam. Unavadal. That is, knowing oneself, leaving adjuncts. That is, we know ourselves without adjuncts. That itself is knowing God. God is that which shines within us as I am. So all we need to do is to remove the adjuncts, and what remains is the pure I am. So our task is not tracing anything back. I mean, thoughts should turn whenever thoughts arise, they should remind us, to whom are these thoughts arising? To me. In other words, we bring our attention back to ourselves. Then we have to hold our attention on ourselves. Because only by being self-attentive do we bring about the subsidence of ego, and thereby trace our way back to our source, which is that pure awareness I am. In other words, the more we hold on to the essential chit aspect of ego, as Bhagavan said, you know, the more we hold on to I am, the more the adjuncts drop off, and we thereby return to and merge back into our source, which is that pure awareness I am. So I hope that adequately answers that question. And then, okay, and then Neera's asked again, when we trace our thoughts to the I thought, is this the state of the perceiver who perceives thoughts without involvement? No, we don't. This is some people in older texts, the perceiver, in other words, ego, is often referred to as sakshi. Sakshi means that which is a witness. In other words, that which is aware of all this. That is ego. Some people think, oh, but it's said that Atman is the Sakshi. Atman here is referring to ego. Or sometimes when our real nature is referred to as ego, Bhagavan said that doesn't mean our real nature perceives all this. It means our real nature is the sannidhi, the presence in which all this appears. But generally, when we're talking about witness as the perceiver, that's referring to ego. So so long as we are perceiving thoughts, we are involved with them. Thoughts don't appear of their own accord. We are aware of thoughts because we attend to them. So we're already involved in them. If we want to avoid being involved in thoughts, we should stop attending to the thoughts. We need to attend to the perceiver of thoughts. In other words, to ego. So our aim is not to attend to thoughts without involvement, because that's impractical, because attending to thoughts means we're already involved in them. If we want to not be involved in thoughts, we need to, so to speak, turn our back on them. We need to turn our attention away from the thoughts, back towards ourselves, the perceiver of the thoughts. Or is it just the perceiver without thought? That is, yes, our aim is we need to ignore all thoughts. We need to turn our attention away from thoughts by turning it back towards ourselves, the perceiver. So when we investigate who am I, we are turning our attention away from the thoughts back towards ourselves, the I who perceives them. But that doesn't mean we continue perceiving them. By turning our attention back towards ourselves, we thereby ignore the thoughts and focus our attention only on I, and thereby bring about the subsidence of ego. And then Rashmi has asked, what does he say about the state of body and mind in the medical unconscious condition? That is, like sleep, any state in which we are not aware of phenomena, as in coma, brought about. I mean, you can be in a coma either because of anesthesia, or if you're involved in a car accident, you have a head injury, you may be in coma. Any state in which we are not aware of phenomena is a state of manolaya. That is a state like sleep. In that state, though we are not aware of any phenomena, we always remain aware of I am, because I am is the eternal reality. So what is always shining is this fundamental awareness I am. In waking, we're aware of ourselves as I am. In dream, we're aware of ourselves as I am. In sleep, we're aware of ourselves as I am. In coma, we're aware of ourselves as I am. When we're under general anesthesia, we're aware of ourselves as I am. Because the fundamental awareness I am is the immutable and imperishable reality. That is the Poro, that is the Vastu, that is the Brahman. So we never cease to be aware I am. But the difference between waking and dream and any state of Manolaya, in Manolaya, ego doesn't rise, and so only pure awareness, the pure awareness I am remains. In waking and dream, ego rises. So instead of being aware of ourselves just as I am, we're aware of ourselves as I am this body. So the medical unconscious condition is just a state of manolaya. It's just a temporary dissolution of mind. But we can't thereby, to bring about, bringing about a temporary dissolution doesn't solve our problems, because the ego keeps on rising again. We need to eradicate ego. In order to eradicate ego, here and now in the waking state, we need to see ourselves as we actually are. In the waking or dream state, we need to see ourselves as we actually are. Then only ego will be eradicated and will never rise again. The difference between Manolaya and Manonasa, as Bhagavan pointed out in verse 13 of Upadeshundiya, from Manolaya, the ego will rise again. Manonasa, it doesn't rise, it never rises again. And then, was there any other question? Okay. Have I answered all the questions, or are there any more?
I think you have addressed all the questions.
Okay.
Jain. Thank you.
Okay, right.
Thank you. So once again, sir, thank you for a very insightful and deep talk on the sensitive topic of ego. Yes. I'm sure it would have stirred enough and more amongst perhaps all of us.
Yeah, this
Wonderful
is the
to
very core of Bhagavan's teachings.
Absolutely, sir. Absolutely. Wonderful to have you as always with us, Mr. James, and we look
Yes.
forward to having you with us next month.
Yes.
Again, the second Sunday of next month is going to be with you.
Right.
Thank you, sir. Namo Ramana.
Yeah. I'm
And
sorry my talk ran over time.
no worries. No worries.
It's
No
a big subject I
Oh,
took on
absolutely.
today.
Absolutely. I would not be surprised if there is a request from the devotees for a follow-up discussion on this topic in the next few weeks.
Yeah, we can go into it a bit more deeply because this is the very heart of Bhagavan's teachings.
Absolutely. I would now request Jayanti ji to commence.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Shri Shama Sada Shiva Ramana, Shri Shama Sada Shiva Ramana, Deshakala Atita Shri Ramana, Shri Samba Sada Shiva Ramana, Deshakalatita Ramana, Tamarai Shevadiye Sharanam Tamarai Shevadiye Sharanam உலகமெனும் மாய கடலில் வாழ்க்கையெனும் படகு செலுத்தி உலகமெனும் மாய கடலில். He says world is like a sea full of illusion. உலகமெனும் மாயை கடலில் வாழ்க்கையெனும் படகை செலுத்தி. வாழ்க்கை is life. Life is like a boat sailing in the sea. வாழ்க்கையெனும் படகை செலுத்தி கரையேறனில் துணை வேண்டும். Then by sailing in the boat, and we have to come to the shore, and the shore is your lotus feet. So for that, please help us. வாழ்க்கையெனும் படகை செலுத்தி கரையேறனில் துணை வேண்டும். ஸ்ரீ சாம்ப சதா சிவா ரமண சாமகான பிரிய ரமணா சாந்தம் எங்கும் நிலவருள்வாய். Samagana Priya is, he likes music, and Shantam Engum Nilava. Everywhere we need peace. For that, please help us. Samagana Priya Ramana Shantam Engum Nilavarulvai Samarasa Sadbodha Swarupam Vilangarulvai Sri Samba Sadashiva Ramana Deshakalatita Ramana Chantamarai Shevadiye Sharanam Atma Rama Ramana Sharanam Bhava Bhayaharana Ramana Sharanam Atma Rama Ramana Sharanam Bhava Bhayaharana Ramana Sharanam Pregunatita Ramana Sharanam Veda Swarupa Ramana Sharanam Trigunadita Ramana Sharanam Veda Swarupa Ramana Sharanam Sachidananda Ramana Sharanam Nityananda Ramana Sharanam Sachidananda Ramana Sharanam Nityananda Ramana Sharanam Jnanananda Ramana Sharanam Paramananda Ramana Sharanam Jnanananda Ramana Sharanam Paramananda Ramana Sharanam Nil Sevadiye Sharanam Nil Sevadiye Sharano, 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 Sharano. Now we will go to Aksharamanamala. Arunachala varakku etra Aksharamanamala shatra Karunakara Ganapati Karam Aruli Kapaye Arunachala Shiva Arunachala Shiva Arunachala Shiva Arunachala Arunachala Shiva Arunachala Shiva Arunachala Shiva Arunachala Arunachala Mena Agameni Pavaragate Verarupa Arunachala அழகு சுந்தரம் போலகமும் நீயோமுக்கு அபிநமாயிருப்போம் அருணாச்சலா இப்படி தப்புனையே நினைப்பே தாயினி யார் விடுவார் அருணாச்சலா ஈங்கிடுமன்னையின் பெரிதருள் புரிவோ இதுவோ உனதருள் அருணாச்சலா உனையே மாற்றி ஓடாதுளதின் மேல் உறுதியாயிருப்பாய் அருணாச்சலா ஓசுற்றுளம் விடாதுனை கள்ளடங்கிட அழகை காட்டருணாச்சலா என்னை அழித்திற்போதென்னை கலவாவிடில் எதுவோ ஆண்மை அருணாச்சலா இந்த உறக்கம் என்னை பிறரிழுக்க இது குணக்கழகோ அருணாச்சலா ஐம்புல கழ்வர் அகத்தினில் போகும்போது அகத்தில் இல்லையோ அருணாச்சலா ஒருவனை ஒளித்தேவர் வருவாருள் சூதே இது அருணாச்சலா ஓம்கார பொருள் ஒப்புயர்வில்லோ இனிகா உனையார் அறிவார் அருணாச்சலா அவ்வை போலென கொன் அருளை கடன் அருணாச்சலா அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சலா அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சலா அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சலா அருணாச்சலம் வாழ்க அன்பர்களும் வாழி அக்ஷரமணமாலை வாழி வாழ்க ஸ்வயம் பிரகாஷ வாழ்க வாழ்கவே சூழ்க சூதாத்ம சக்தி சூழ்க சூழ்கவே வாழ்க ஸ்வயம் பிரகாஷ வாழ்க வாழ்கவே சுதாத்ம சக்தி சூழ்க சூழ்கவே ஏழுலகம் ஜீவன் முக்தி இன்பம் பொங்கவே ஏழுலகம் ஜீவன் முக்தி இன்பம் பொங்கவே இதயமாகும் இறைவனாகி எல்லாம் ஓங்கவே இதயமாகும் இறைவனாகி எல்லாம் ஓங்கவே பாழ்மனம் அகல்ல வாழ்வு பாழ்படொழிகவே பாழ்மனம் அகல்ல வாழ்வு பாழ்படொழிகவே பரம சச்சிதானந்தாத்மா பால் பொழிகவே பரம சச்சிதானந்தாத்மா பால் பொழிகவே வாழ்க ஸ்வயம் பிரகாஷ வாழ்க வாழ்கவே சூழ்க சூதாத்ம சக்தி சூழ்க சூழ்கவே தட்டிலாத நித்திய ஜீவ தத்துவமூங்கவே தட்டிலாத நித்திய ஜீவ தத்துவமூங்கவே தன்மயத்தில் சின்மயம் தழைத்து ஓங்கவே தன்மயத்தில் சின்மயம் தழைத்து ஓங்கவே எட்டு திக்கும் அம்ச சோகம் எதிரொலிக்கவே எட்டு திக்கும் அம்ச சோகம் எதிரொலிக்கவே எல்லாம் பிரம்மம் என்னும் உண்மையை வகிக்கவே எல்லாம் பிரம்மம் என்னும் உண்மை இறைவகிக்கவே வாழ்க ஸ்வயம் பிரகாசம் வாழ்க வாழ்கவே சூழ்க சோதாத்ம சக்தி சூழ்க சூழ்கவே சூழ்க சூழ்கவே சூழ்க சூழ்கவே.
Thank you so much, Jayanti Didi. Now I would request everyone to join in for the Aarti, and everyone is being unmuted as we speak right now. Narayananji?
Yes, sir. Okay. Om Bhurvasva Tasya Sarvavaryam Bhargo Devasya Dhimahi Dhiyo Yona Prachodayat Dev Savita Visva Satyam Dovena Pasijami Amrutvam Swaha Om Prana Swaha Om Abhaya Swaha Om Dhyana Swaha Om Dhyana Swaha Arunati Shiramana Namaha Arunati Shiramana Namaha पुरंदर गोचीरम गंगाधरनिर्द्यम समर्पयामि मध्ये मध्ये भागं समर्पयामि अमृतोपदान सूत्रावसं समर्पयामि नीराजनं समर्पयामि नीराजनानन्तरं महासमनीयं समर्पयामि हरि ओम हरि ओम हरि ओम कर्पूरं समर्पयामि
कोई परेशानी नहीं होगा वो देखो क्या हाँ
ओम राजाधिराजाय प्रत्यक्षायिने नमो वयं वैष्णवाय कुर्महे समे रामाय प्रियं कामेश्वरो वैष्णवो सदादु कुबेराय वैष्णवाय
रोटी बना रही पराठा बना रही है हल्का सा
जो राजा सन राजो वा सोमेरे जते देवस्वामेनानि अवंजीवन्ति ये दावन्तो वै देवानां स्वाहा स एवास्मै स्वान्तैषक्ति स एनं गुणस्तवन्ते राजाय देवराजा भवति न तत्र सूर्यो पादचक्रराजं देवास्तुभवान् सुभावेक्षणि तमेवापि ब्रह्मादि सर्वं सत्यवादा सर्वभूतं विभाति कर्पूरं समर्पयामि नीराजनं समर्पयामि नीराजनन्तरम् आत्मन्यं समर्पयामि हरि ओम हरि ओम हरि ओम यो वां पुष्पं वेद पुष्पवान् प्रजावान् पशुमान् बोधि चंद्रमा वां पुष्पं पुष्पं पुष्पवान् प्रजावान् पशुमान् बोधि ओम तद्ब्रह्मा ओम तद्वायु ओम तदात्मा ओम तत्सत्य ओम तत्सर्वं सर्वभूते भुवाया पुष्पं भूतिषु त्वं निर्णयं मत्कारकं इन्द्रस्तं रुद्रस्तं विष्णुस्तं ब्रह्मं रुद्रावि ओम तदा भगवतो अमृतं परमेश्वरं न कर्मणा प्रजयाजने नित्यानंदे अमृतत्वमानसु परेण नाहं मृतं भुवायं विप्राजते रत्यो विसन्ति वेदांग विज्ञानसे नित्यदार्थ संन्यास योगातवे शुद्धसत्त्वाः ते ब्रह्मलोके परामताने परामृतात् परिमुच्यन्ति सर्वे परं विमामं परमेश्वमूलं यत् पुण्डरीकं पुरमस्य दरुंसतं तत्रावित्तक्रमकगनं विशोभत् तस्मिन् यदङ्गत् तद्भावित्यं यो वेदामोश्वर प्रोक्तो वेदार्थस्य प्रतिष्ठितः तस्य प्रकृतिलीनस्य परसमहेश्वरः मन्त्रपुष्पं श्रीरमणमहर्षिः समर्पयामि ॐ तत्सत् ब्रह्मार्पणमस्तु हरि ओम हरि ओम हरि ओम यानि दानि सप्पावानि देवादत्तानि तानि गच्छन्ति अरुणाचल नमः सुब्रह्मण्याय स्वामिनाथाय दक्षिणामूर्तियां आचार्यां भैरवाय नंदीवासवाय रूपाय नमः शिवाय ओम नमः शिवाय ओम नमः शिवाय हरि ओम हरि ओम हरि ओम
Thank you, everyone. This brings us to the closure of the satsang. We look forward to meeting everyone on Jayanti Day. Namo Ramana.